My son-in-law called me a parasite and said I was mooching off his success living in what he thought was his house. So I pulled out the mortgage documents with my name on them and watched his arrogant face crumble when he realized I owned everything and could evict him whenever I wanted. I'm Frank. I'm 68 years old, and this is the story of how my entitled son-in-law learned the hard way that assumptions can destroy your entire life in a single conversation. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. You know, there's nothing quite like the moment when someone who's been treating you like garbage suddenly realizes they've been completely wrong about who holds the power in the relationship. It's especially satisfying when that someone is a pompous know-it-all who spent months making your life miserable because he thinks he's better than you. This story is about respect, assumptions, and what happens when an arrogant young man discovers that the old guy he's been pushing around actually owns the ground he's standing on. It all started 18 months ago when my daughter Sarah married Derek, a 32-year-old software engineer who thought his computer science degree and six-figure salary made him the smartest person in every room. Sarah had been dating Derek for 2 years before they got married, and from the very beginning, I could tell he looked down on me. Derek was one of those guys who measured everyone's worth by their income and education level, and in his mind, I was just a blue-collar worker who'd never amounted to much. I'm a retired electrician who spent 42 years working with my hands, building and fixing things that actually matter to people's daily lives. I started my own electrical contracting business when I was 25 years old, worked 7 days a week for decades, and built a solid reputation in our community. But to Derek, I was just some old tradesman who probably didn't understand how the modern world worked. He never said it directly, but I could see it in his eyes every time we talked about anything related to money or business. Derek would make little comments about how different things were in his generation, how technology had changed everything, and how people like me probably had trouble adapting to the new economy. He'd talk about his investments and his retirement planning like he was some kind of financial genius, always with this tone that suggested he was educating the poor old man who didn't know any better. It was condescending as hell, but I kept my mouth shut because I loved Sarah and wanted her to be happy. Sarah met Derek through a dating app, and she was immediately impressed by his education and career prospects. My daughter is a wonderful woman, but she'd always been attracted to men who seemed sophisticated and successful. Her first serious boyfriend had been a law student, and before Derek, she dated a doctor who turned out to be married. I think Sarah was looking for security and status, which I understood given that her mother and I had struggled financially when she was growing up. I'd worked hard to provide for my family, but there were times when money was tight, and Sarah remembered those lean years. When Derek proposed to Sarah, she was over the moon. He'd planned this elaborate proposal at an expensive restaurant, complete with a photographer to capture the moment and a ring that cost more than most people make in 3 months. Derek made sure everyone knew how much he'd spent on that ring, mentioning the price in casual conversation like it was proof of how much he loved Sarah. The whole thing felt flashy and performative to me, but Sarah was thrilled, so I kept my opinions to myself. The wedding was another display of Derek's need to impress everyone with his success. He insisted on paying for most of it himself, which was generous, but he also made sure everyone knew he was footing the bill. During his wedding speech, Derek talked about how excited he was to provide for Sarah and give her the life she deserved. He mentioned his career prospects, his investment portfolio, and his 5-year plan for financial independence. It was supposed to be romantic, but it sounded more like a business presentation to me. After the wedding, Sarah and Derek moved in together in Derek's apartment downtown. It was a nice place in a trendy neighborhood, the kind of modern building with a gym and a rooftop deck that young professionals love. Derek was proud of that apartment and loved showing it off to visitors. He'd give tour pointing out all the high-end appliances and smart home features, always mentioning how much everything cost. The rent alone was more than my mortgage payment, but Derek saw it as an investment in his image and lifestyle. For the first few months of their marriage, everything seemed fine. Sarah was happy. Derek was his usual self-important self, and they seemed to be building a life together. But then Derek's company went through some restructuring, and he got laid off along with about 30% of their workforce. Suddenly, the hotshot software engineer was unemployed and scrambling to find a new job in a competitive market. The tech industry had taken a downturn, and companies weren't hiring like they used to. Derek's confidence took a major hit when he realized his skills weren't as in demand as he'd thought. Derek spent 3 months looking for work, burning through his savings and watching his investment portfolio shrink as he cashed out funds to cover their expenses. The expensive apartment that had been a symbol of his success suddenly became a financial burden. Sarah was working as a marketing coordinator, but her salary alone wasn't enough to maintain their lifestyle. They started falling behind on rent and credit card payments, and Derek's pride was taking a beating every day he remained unemployed. That's when they came to me asking for help. Sarah called me one evening, clearly upset, and asked if she and Derek could move in with me temporarily until Derek found a new job. She explained that they were struggling financially and couldn't afford their apartment anymore. She was embarrassed to ask, but they didn't have many options. My house had plenty of room, and I'd always told Sarah she could come home anytime she needed to. Of course I said yes, but I could tell Derek wasn't happy about having to move in with his father-in-law. I own a large 4-bedroom house in a quiet suburban neighborhood about 30 minutes outside the city. It's not fancy or trendy like Derek's downtown apartment, but it's comfortable and well-maintained. I bought the house 25 years ago when the neighborhood was still developing, and I've put a lot of work into improving it over the years. The house has a big backyard, a 2-car garage, and enough space for a family to spread out and be comfortable. I raised Sarah in this house after her mother died when Sarah was 12, and it holds a lot of memories for both of us. When Sarah and Derek moved in, I gave them the master bedroom and converted my home office into a temporary bedroom for myself. I wanted them to have privacy and space while they got back on their feet. I didn't charge them rent or ask them to contribute to utilities or groceries. I figured they were going through a tough time, and family helps family. Derek seemed grateful at first, thanking me for my generosity and promising it would only be temporary until he found a new position. But it didn't take long for Derek's true colors to show once he was living under my roof. Within a few weeks, Derek started acting like he owned the place. He'd rearrange furniture without asking, change the thermostat settings to his preference, and invite his friends over without checking with me first. He'd use my computer and my internet for his job search, which was fine, but he'd also monopolize the home office for hours at a time and get annoyed if I needed to use my own space. Derek started treating me like I was the guest in my own home. The breaking point came about 2 months after they'd moved in. Derek had been interviewing for several positions, but hadn't received any offers yet. He was getting frustrated and stressed, and he started taking that stress out on everyone around him. He'd snap at Sarah for minor things, complain about the house being too quiet during the day, and make comments about how living in the suburbs was affecting his mental health. He missed the energy and convenience of city living, and he made sure everyone knew it. One evening, Derek's college buddy Marcus came over for dinner. Marcus was another tech worker who'd managed to keep his job during the layoffs, and he was clearly doing well financially. During dinner, Marcus asked Derek how the job search was going, and when he planned to move back to the city. Derek got defensive and started making excuses about why he was taking his time finding the right opportunity. He didn't want to admit that he was desperate and couldn't afford to be picky. That's when Derek made a comment that should have been my first warning about his changing attitude. He told Marcus that living with me wasn't so bad because it gave him time to really evaluate his options without financial pressure. He said he was taking advantage of the situation to be strategic about his next career move. The way he said it made it sound like staying in my house was a smart business decision rather than a family helping him through a crisis. He wasn't grateful for my help. He was treating it like a calculated move on his part. Over the next few weeks, Derek's sense of entitlement grew stronger. He started making suggestions about how I could improve the house, pointing out repairs that needed to be done and upgrades that would increase the property value. He'd comment on my furniture choices, my cable package, and even my grocery shopping habits. Derek seemed to think that because he had a college education and business experience, he was qualified to advise me on how to manage my own home and finances. The most irritating thing was how Derek talked about money in front of me. He'd discuss his previous salary and bonuses like they proved he was more successful than me. He'd mention his investment strategies and retirement planning, always with this tone that suggested I couldn't possibly understand such sophisticated concepts. Derek acted like my blue-collar background meant I was financially illiterate, even though I'd managed to own my home outright and save enough money to retire comfortably at 65. Derek also started making comments about the neighborhood and the house that were clearly criticisms disguised as observations. He'd mention how much nicer his downtown apartment had been, how convenient city living was compared to suburban life, and how he missed having access to good restaurants and cultural events. He'd talk about the kind of house he planned to buy once he got back on his feet, describing features and amenities that my house didn't have. It was his way of making it clear that staying with me was temporary and beneath his usual standards. The situation got worse when Derek finally received a job offer after 3 months of unemployment. The position paid about $20,000 less than his previous job, but it was steady work with benefits. Instead of being grateful for the opportunity, Derek was bitter about having to take what he considered a step backward in his career. He accepted the job because he had to, but he made it clear that he saw it as temporary until something better came along. You'd think that getting a job would motivate Derek to start looking for his own place again, but instead, he seemed to settle into life at my house like he planned to stay indefinitely. When Sarah asked him about their plans for moving out, Derek said they should take their time and save money before rushing into another lease. He said it made financial sense to stay with me while they rebuilt their savings and waited for his salary to increase. Derek was treating my home like a convenient cost-cutting measure rather than a temporary refuge. That's when Derek started talking about the house like he had some ownership stake in it. He'd refer to it as our house when talking to friends or making plans. He'd talk about home improvement projects we should do, as if he had a say in how I maintained my property. Derek even started answering the door when visitors came by, introducing himself as if he lived there permanently rather than temporarily. It was becoming clear that Derek saw himself as more than just a guest staying with his father-in-law. The final straw came on a Saturday morning in late October. I was in my garage working on a woodworking project when Derek came out to talk to me. He'd been living in my house for 6 months at that point, and I was starting to feel like I needed to have a conversation with him and Sarah about their long-term plans. I was hoping Derek would bring up the subject himself, maybe announce that they'd found an apartment and would be moving out soon. Instead, Derek started the conversation by telling me about a promotion opportunity at his new job. Instead of expressing gratitude for my help or discussing plans to move out, Derek started lecturing me about the importance of maximizing the house's potential. He said he'd been thinking about ways to improve the property value and had some ideas for renovations that would benefit both of us. Derek talked about finishing the basement, updating the kitchen, and landscaping the backyard like he was planning to stick around long enough to see those projects completed. He even suggested that we should consider refinancing the mortgage to get a better interest rate and free up some cash for improvements. The way Derek was talking, you'd think he was a co-owner rather than a temporary house guest. What really got under my skin was Derek's assumption that I needed his financial advice and guidance. He started explaining how equity worked and how home improvements could increase resale value, like he was teaching a child about basic concepts. Derek clearly thought that his business education made him more qualified than me to make decisions about my own property. He talked about market trends and investment strategies with this condescending tone that made it obvious he thought I was out of my depth when it came to managing my finances. Then Derek said something that made my blood boil. He told me that he'd been researching the neighborhood's property values and thought I was sitting on a gold mine that I wasn't properly leveraging. He said the house was worth significantly more than I'd probably paid for it, and that I should consider using that equity to diversify my investment portfolio. Derek suggested that I could take out a home equity loan to invest in stocks or mutual funds, potentially earning a higher return than just letting the house appreciate naturally. He presented this like he was doing me a favor by sharing his superior financial knowledge. The conversation took an even more insulting turn when Derek started talking about my retirement planning. He asked if I had enough saved for long-term care and whether I'd considered the impact of inflation on my fixed income. Derek suggested that I might want to think about downsizing to a smaller place and using the proceeds to boost my retirement savings. He said a house this size was probably more than I needed as a single person, and that maintaining it was likely eating into my budget unnecessarily. The implication was clear. Derek thought I was an old man who didn't understand money and needed his guidance to make smart decisions. But the comment that finally pushed me over the edge was when Derek said he was glad he could help me out by staying in the house and contributing to its upkeep. He claimed that having young people living there was good for the property because we were keeping it active and well-maintained. Derek said he'd noticed several small repairs that needed attention and had been taking care of them to help preserve the house's value. He acted like he was doing me a favor by living in my house rent-free and occasionally fixing a leaky faucet or replacing a light bulb. That's when Derek crossed the line completely. He looked me straight in the eye and said, "Frank, I know you're probably worried about being able to afford this place on your own, but don't stress about it. As long as Sarah and I are here, you don't have to carry the financial burden alone. We're family now, and we take care of each other. I make good money, and I can help with the mortgage payments and maintenance costs. You don't have to be too proud to accept help from your son-in-law." The arrogance and condescension in that statement took my breath away. Derek actually thought he was supporting me financially by living in my house without paying rent. He believed that his presence was somehow helping me afford my mortgage and maintain my property. In Derek's twisted mind, I was the one who was struggling financially and needed his assistance to keep my head above water. He saw himself as the successful provider who was generously helping out his elderly father-in-law. I stood there in my garage, holding a piece of sandpaper and trying to process what Derek had just said to me. This man had been living in my house for 6 months without paying a dime in rent, utilities, or groceries. I'd been supporting him and my daughter while he looked for work, and now he had the audacity to act like he was the one helping me. Derek's assumption that I needed his financial assistance was so far from reality that it would have been funny if it wasn't so insulting. I realized that Derek had constructed an entire narrative in his head where he was the successful breadwinner, and I was the struggling retiree who couldn't afford to maintain his lifestyle alone. In Derek's version of reality, my willingness to let them stay in the house wasn't generosity, it was desperation. He thought I needed them there to help with expenses, and that his job made him the financially stable one in the relationship. Derek had convinced himself that he was doing me a favor by living in my house and occasionally helping with minor maintenance tasks. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how Derek had been treating me since he moved in. His suggestions about home improvements weren't helpful advice. They were him planning changes to what he considered his living space. His comments about the neighborhood and property values weren't casual observations. They were him evaluating the asset he thought he had access to. Derek's entire attitude toward me, and the house made sense once I understood that he saw himself as the financially responsible party in the arrangement. I decided it was time to set Derek straight about exactly who owned what and who was helping whom. I put down my sandpaper, walked over to my workbench, and opened the filing cabinet where I kept my important documents. I pulled out the folder containing my mortgage paperwork, property deed, and tax records. Then I looked Derek straight in the eye and said, "Son, I think there's something you need to see." Derek followed me into the house, probably thinking I was going to show him some repair estimate or property assessment that proved I needed his financial help. Instead, I spread the documents out on the kitchen table and watched his face as he realized what he was looking at. The mortgage documents showed that I'd paid off the house completely in 2019, 3 years before Derek even met my daughter. The property deed had my name on it as the sole owner, with no co-signers or joint ownership arrangements. The tax records showed that I'd been paying property taxes on a house worth significantly more than Derek had estimated. Derek's face went through several different expressions as he processed what he was seeing. First, there was confusion, as he tried to understand why I was showing him these documents. Then came recognition as he realized that the house was paid off and owned outright. Finally, there was something that looked like panic as the implications of his mistake started to sink in. Derek had been living in my house, making plans for my property, and offering to help with expenses that didn't exist, all while assuming that I was financially dependent on his assistance. I let Derek study the documents for a few minutes before I started explaining the reality of our situation. I told him that I'd bought the house 25 years ago for $98,000, back when the neighborhood was still being developed. I'd worked overtime and side jobs to pay extra on the mortgage principal every month, cutting what should have been a 30-year loan down to 16 years. I'd owned the house free and clear for the past 5 years, with no monthly mortgage payment and no debt secured by the property. I also showed Derek my bank statements and investment account summaries, not because I owed him an explanation, but because I wanted him to understand exactly how wrong his assumptions had been. My retirement savings were substantial, built up over 4 decades of steady work and careful money management. My pension from the Electrical Workers Union was generous, and my Social Security benefits were more than enough to cover my living expenses. I wasn't struggling financially, I wasn't worried about affording my house, and I certainly didn't need Derek's help to maintain my property or lifestyle. Derek's reaction to this information was fascinating to watch. Instead of being embarrassed about his mistake or grateful for my generosity, he seemed almost angry that I'd let him believe something that wasn't true. Derek asked why I hadn't corrected his assumptions about my financial situation, like it was my fault that he jumped to the wrong conclusions. He seemed to think that I should have been bragging about my assets or making it clear that I didn't need his help, rather than simply accepting his assistance gracefully when he offered it. What Derek didn't understand was that I'd never asked for his help or given him any reason to think I needed financial assistance. He'd created that narrative in his own mind because it made him feel important and successful. Derek had assumed that because I was older and worked in a blue-collar trade, I must be struggling financially. He'd looked at my modest lifestyle and comfortable home and somehow concluded that I was living beyond my means or barely getting by on a fixed income. Derek's assumptions said more about his prejudices and insecurities than they did about my actual situation. I explained to Derek that when I'd agreed to let him and Sarah stay in the house, it was because I wanted to help my daughter during a difficult time. I wasn't looking for financial assistance or hoping to split my living expenses with roommates. I was offering them a free place to stay until they got back on their feet, no strings attached and no expectations of payment. Derek's presence in my house wasn't helping me afford anything. It was me helping him afford to rebuild his savings and restart his career after a setback. The conversation got even more uncomfortable when Derek started asking questions about my long-term plans for the house and my estate planning. He wanted to know if Sarah was listed as a beneficiary and whether the house would become part of her inheritance someday. Derek seemed to be calculating his potential future stake in the property, like he was already planning how to leverage my assets for his own benefit. It was becoming clear that Derek's interest in staying in the house wasn't just about saving money in the short term, but about positioning himself to benefit from my wealth in the long run. That's when I realized that Derek's entire attitude toward me and our living arrangement had been based on his assumption that he was the successful one doing me a favor. In his mind, letting him stay in the house was my way of securing financial help from a younger, more prosperous family member. Derek thought he was throwing me a lifeline, not the other way around. His condescending advice about property management and financial planning had been his way of sharing his superior knowledge with a struggling older relative who didn't know any better. Derek's shock at learning the truth was almost comical. Here was a man who'd been unemployed for 3 months, had burned through his savings, and was living rent-free in someone else's house, and he'd somehow convinced himself that he was the financially stable one in the relationship. Derek had been so focused on his college education and his previous salary that he'd completely misjudged the economic reality of our situation. He'd assumed that educational credentials and tech industry experience automatically translated to greater wealth and financial security than what a tradesman could achieve through decades of hard work and smart money management. I decided it was time to have a very direct conversation with Derek about his future plans. I told him that I'd been happy to help him and Sarah during their difficult time, but that I'd expected their stay to be temporary. It had been 6 months since they'd moved in. Derek had been employed for 3 months, and it was time for them to start looking for their own place again. I explained that while they were welcome to take their time finding the right apartment, I needed them to start actively searching and planning their move. Derek's response revealed just how entitled he'd become during his stay in my house. Instead of thanking me for my patience and generosity, Derek started arguing about why it made financial sense for them to stay longer. He said they were still rebuilding their savings, and that moving too quickly would put them back in a financially vulnerable position. Derek claimed that staying with me for another 6 months would allow them to save enough money for a substantial down payment on a house of their own, rather than throwing money away on rent. He was treating my home like a free hotel that he could use as long as it benefited his financial planning. What really irritated me was Derek's assumption that his financial planning was my responsibility to accommodate. He talked about their savings goals and timeline for homeownership like I was supposed to structure my living situation around their needs. Derek seemed to think that because I owned my house outright and didn't have mortgage payments, I had unlimited capacity to house them indefinitely. He wasn't considering that I might want my privacy back, might have plans for the space they were occupying, or might simply prefer to live alone after spending most of my adult life with other people. Derek also started making comments about how much money Sarah and I could save by combining households permanently. He suggested that it might make sense for all of us to continue living together even after they'd stabilized financially. Derek talked about the benefits of multi-generational living, shared expenses, and pooled resources like he was proposing a mutually beneficial business arrangement. He seemed to think that because the house was large enough to accommodate everyone comfortably, there was no reason for them to move out as long as we all got along reasonably well. The conversation took an even more disturbing turn when Derek started talking about his long-term career prospects and earning potential. He explained that his current job was just a stepping stone to something better, and that within a few years he'd be making more money than ever before. Derek seemed to think that his future success would somehow retroactively justify his current behavior and expectations. He talked about how he'd be able to contribute more to household expenses once his salary increased, like he was negotiating the terms of a permanent living arrangement. That's when Derek said something that made me realize just how far his sense of entitlement had grown. He told me that he appreciated everything I'd done for them, but that he hoped I understood that their presence in the house was mutually beneficial. Derek claimed that having young people around was good for me socially and emotionally, that Sarah and he provided companionship and energy that kept me from becoming isolated and depressed. He said studies showed that older adults who lived with family members were healthier and happier than those who lived alone. Derek was actually trying to convince me that I needed them in my house for my own well-being. The arrogance of that statement was breathtaking. Derek was suggesting that his presence in my house was a form of elder care, that he and Sarah were helping me maintain my mental health and social connections by living with me. In Derek's mind, he wasn't just saving money by staying in my house. He was providing a valuable service that I should be grateful for. He'd managed to reframe his financial dependency as a favor he was doing for me, a way of ensuring that I didn't become a lonely old man rattling around in an empty house. I realized that Derek had constructed an elaborate justification for his behavior that painted him as the generous party in our arrangement. In his version of reality, he was sacrificing his independence and privacy to live with his elderly father-in-law because it was good for me. Derek had convinced himself that moving out would be selfish because it would leave me alone and potentially struggling with both financial and emotional challenges. He saw himself as the responsible son-in-law who was stepping up to take care of his wife's father, even though it meant giving up the urban lifestyle he preferred. The more Derek talked, the clearer it became that he had no intention of moving out anytime soon. He'd settled into my house like he planned to stay indefinitely, making long-term plans and thinking of himself as a permanent resident rather than a temporary guest. Derek's questions about my estate planning and inheritance arrangements suggested that he was already thinking about his future ownership stake in the property. He was treating my house like an investment that he could benefit from both now and later, rather than a generous gift from a family member who was trying to help during a difficult time. I decided it was time to make my expectations crystal clear. I told Derek that he and Sarah had until the end of the year to find their own place and move out. I explained that I'd been patient and understanding about their situation, but that my generosity had limits. I needed them to start apartment hunting immediately, and to have a concrete moving date by Christmas. I made it clear that this wasn't a negotiation or a suggestion. It was a requirement for continuing to live in my house. Derek's reaction to my ultimatum was revealing. Instead of accepting my decision gracefully or thanking me for the additional time, Derek started arguing about the timeline and questioning my motives. He asked why I was suddenly in a hurry to get rid of them, whether someone had been pressuring me to make this decision, and if I was having second thoughts about family living arrangements. Derek seemed to think that my desire to have my house back was unreasonable or suspicious, rather than a natural response to having house guests for 6 months. Derek also started making veiled threats about what would happen if I forced them to move out before they were financially ready. He mentioned that Sarah was stressed about money, and that pushing them out too quickly could damage her mental health and our relationship. Derek suggested that I should consider the impact my decision would have on Sarah's well-being and our family dynamics. He was essentially trying to guilt me into extending their stay by making me feel responsible for any negative consequences of their moving out. The manipulation in Derek's approach was obvious and offensive. He was using my love for Sarah as leverage to get what he wanted, suggesting that being a good father meant accommodating his timeline rather than setting reasonable boundaries for my own home. Derek seemed to think that because Sarah was my daughter, I should prioritize their financial convenience over my own comfort and privacy. He was treating my relationship with Sarah like a weakness he could exploit to get his way. What Derek didn't understand was that I'd already talked to Sarah about the situation privately, and she was embarrassed by how long they'd been staying with me. Sarah had been looking at apartments for weeks and was eager to get back to living independently with her husband. She appreciated my help during their difficult time, but she didn't want to overstay her welcome or put me in an uncomfortable position. Sarah understood that 6 months was already a generous amount of time for house guests, and she was ready to start rebuilding their life in their own space. The difference between Sarah's attitude and Derek's was striking. My daughter was grateful, respectful, and considerate of my needs and boundaries. Derek was entitled, demanding, and focused entirely on his own benefits and convenience. Sarah saw staying in my house as a temporary solution to a specific problem, while Derek saw it as a long-term arrangement that he could extend indefinitely as long as it served his purposes. Sarah was planning for their future independence, while Derek was planning for permanent dependence on my resources and generosity. I realized that Derek's behavior wasn't just about money or housing. It was about power and control. He'd found a situation where he could live comfortably without taking full responsibility for his expenses, and he didn't want to give that up. Derek enjoyed the financial freedom that came with not paying rent or utilities, and he enjoyed the sense of importance that came with thinking he was helping me manage my finances and property. Moving out would mean returning to the stress and responsibility of supporting himself and Sarah independently, without the safety net of my resources. Derek had also grown comfortable with the idea that he had some claim to my house and my financial decisions. His suggestions about renovations and improvements weren't just friendly advice. They were him planning changes to what he considered his living space. Derek's questions about my estate planning weren't casual curiosity. They were him calculating his potential future inheritance. He'd started thinking of my assets as partially his, either through his marriage to Sarah or through his contributions to the household that existed only in his imagination. The final confrontation came the next weekend, when Derek invited some of his friends over for a barbecue without asking my permission first. I came home from running errands to find 5 people in my backyard, using my grill and drinking beer they'd brought with them. Derek was playing host like he owned the place, giving tour of the house, and talking about our landscaping plans for the spring. He introduced me to his friends as his father-in-law, but the way he presented the situation made it sound like we were roommates or co-owners, rather than him being a guest in my house. That evening, after Derek's friends had left, I asked him to join me in the living room for a serious conversation. I told Derek that inviting people over without asking was unacceptable, and that it demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of his status in my house. I explained that he was a guest, not a resident with hosting privileges, and that treating my home like his own was disrespectful and presumptuous. I also told Derek that his behavior over the past few weeks had convinced me that he needed to move out sooner rather than later. Derek's response was everything I'd expected and worse. He accused me of being unreasonable and unwelcoming, saying that good families support each other through difficult times without keeping score or imposing arbitrary deadlines. Derek claimed that I was prioritizing my own comfort over Sarah's well-being, and that forcing them to move out would put unnecessary financial stress on their marriage. He said he'd thought I was a more generous and understanding person, and that he was disappointed by my selfishness and lack of family loyalty. Then Derek made the comment that finally pushed me to the breaking point. He looked me straight in the eye and said, "Frank, I don't understand why you're being such a parasite about this. Sarah and I have been carrying the financial load around here for months, and now you want to kick us out just when we're getting back on our feet. You've been mooching off our success and living in this house that you couldn't afford to maintain on your own. The least you could do is show some gratitude for everything we've done for you." The word parasite hit me like a physical blow. This man who'd been living in my house rent-free for 6 months, eating my food, using my utilities, and sleeping in my bed, had just called me a parasite. Derek actually believed that he'd been supporting me financially and that I was the one taking advantage of the situation. His delusion had reached such an extreme level that he'd completely reversed our roles in his mind, casting himself as the generous provider and me as the freeloading dependent. I stood up, walked to my filing cabinet, and pulled out the folder of documents I'd shown Derek the week before. But this time, I also grabbed the folder containing my property tax records, homeowners insurance policies, and utility bills. I spread everything out on the coffee table and told Derek to take a good look at exactly who was paying for what in this house. I showed Derek the property tax bills that I'd been paying for 25 years, the insurance policies that listed me as the sole owner and beneficiary, and the utility bills that had been in my name since before Derek was even born. I pulled out my bank statements showing the automatic payments for all the household expenses, none of which included any contributions from Derek or Sarah. I showed him the receipts for groceries, home repairs, and maintenance that I'd been covering entirely on my own since they moved in. Then I pulled out the big guns. I showed Derek the original purchase documents for the house, the records of every mortgage payment I'd made over 16 years, and the satisfaction of mortgage document that proved I owned the house free and clear. I showed him my retirement account statements, my pension documentation, and my Social Security benefit summaries. I laid out a complete picture of my financial situation that made it crystal clear that I didn't need anyone's help to afford my lifestyle or maintain my property. Derek's face went white as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. I could see him trying to process the reality that he'd been completely wrong about everything. The man he'd been calling a parasite was actually worth more than Derek would probably earn in the next 20 years. The house he thought I couldn't afford to maintain on my own was paid off and worth 3 times what Derek made in a year. The elderly father-in-law he thought he was supporting was actually supporting him, and had been doing so generously for 6 months, without asking for anything in return. I let Derek study the documents for several minutes before I started talking. When I finally spoke, I kept my voice calm and quiet, but every word was designed to make sure he understood exactly how wrong he'd been about our situation. I told Derek that he'd been living in my house, eating my food, using my electricity, and sleeping in my bed without contributing a single dollar to any household expense. I explained that his presence hadn't helped me afford anything or maintain anything, but had actually cost me money in increased utility bills, grocery costs, and wear and tear on my property. I told Derek that calling me a parasite was not only ungrateful but also completely backward, since he was the one who'd been living off someone else's resources for half a year. I also made it clear to Derek that his assumptions about my financial situation were based on nothing more than his own prejudices and ignorance. I explained that his belief that I needed his help was rooted in stereotypes about blue-collar workers and older adults that had no basis in reality. Derek had looked at my modest lifestyle and work history and assumed that I must be struggling financially, without considering that I might simply prefer to live below my means rather than constantly trying to impress people with expensive purchases and flashy displays of wealth. I told Derek that his condescending advice about property management and financial planning had been particularly insulting coming from someone who'd burned through his savings in 3 months and couldn't afford his own rent. I pointed out that he'd been lecturing me about investment strategies while living rent-free in a house that I owned outright. Derek had been giving financial advice to someone whose net worth was probably 5 times his own, all while depending on that person's charity to keep a roof over his head. The look on Derek's face was a mixture of embarrassment, anger, and confusion. He clearly didn't know how to respond to having his entire worldview challenged so directly. Derek had built his self-image around being the successful, educated, financially savvy member of the family, and learning that he'd been completely dependent on someone he considered inferior was devastating to his ego. He'd spent months feeling superior to me and thinking he was doing me a favor, only to discover that he was actually the charity case in the relationship. I could see Derek trying to find some way to salvage his pride or justify his behavior, but there was no defense for what he'd said and done. He'd called me a parasite while living as an actual parasite in my house. He'd accused me of mooching off his success while mooching off my generosity. Derek had projected his own behavior onto me so completely that he'd lost touch with reality. Finally, Derek tried to backtrack and claim that he'd been misunderstood. He said he hadn't meant to call me a parasite, that he'd been stressed about money, and had said things he didn't mean. Derek claimed that he was grateful for my help, and that he'd always intended to contribute more to household expenses once his financial situation stabilized. He tried to frame his earlier comments as concern for my well-being rather than assumptions about my financial dependence on him. But it was too late for apologies and explanations. Derek had revealed exactly what he thought of me and our living arrangement, and his true feelings couldn't be taken back with a few awkward excuses. I'd heard him tell his friends that he was helping me manage the household finances. I'd listened to him lecture me about property values and investment strategies like I was a confused old man who didn't understand money. Derek had shown me exactly how much respect he had for me and my intelligence, and no amount of backpedaling could change that. I told Derek that he and Sarah had until the end of the month to find a new place and move out. I explained that I'd given him every opportunity to show gratitude and respect, and that he'd failed spectacularly. I said that his comment about me being a parasite had been the final straw, and that I was no longer willing to tolerate his presence in my house. I made it clear that this wasn't a negotiation or a punishment that could be appealed. It was a final decision based on his demonstrated character and attitude. Derek tried to argue that I was being unfair and that he deserved another chance to prove himself. He said that people sometimes say things they don't mean when they're stressed, and that he shouldn't be judged by one moment of poor judgment. Derek claimed that he'd learned his lesson and would be more respectful going forward if I just give him the opportunity. He even offered to start paying rent and contributing to household expenses, like he was negotiating the terms of a lease rather than apologizing for months of freeloading and disrespect. I told Derek that his offer to start paying rent proved that he'd understood all along that he should have been contributing financially. If he'd known he should be paying his way, then his failure to do so had been a deliberate choice rather than an innocent misunderstanding. Derek had been perfectly happy to live off my generosity as long as he could convince himself that he was actually helping me, but now that his delusion had been shattered, he was suddenly willing to pay his fair share. It was too little, too late. The conversation ended with Derek storming out of the room, presumably to tell Sarah about our discussion. I could hear them talking in their bedroom for hours that night, and I could only imagine how Derek was trying to spin the situation to make himself look like the victim. But Sarah knew her father well enough to understand that I wouldn't have reacted so strongly without good reason, and she'd probably been noticing Derek's entitled behavior herself. The next morning, Sarah came to talk to me while Derek was at work. She apologized for her husband's behavior and said she'd been embarrassed by some of his comments and attitudes over the past few weeks. Sarah told me that she'd been trying to convince Derek that they needed to start looking for their own place, but that he'd been resistant to the idea. She said she was grateful for everything I'd done for them, and that she understood why I wanted them to move out. Sarah also told me something that explained a lot about Derek's behavior. Apparently, Derek had been telling his friends and coworkers that he was living with me because I needed the help, not because he needed a place to stay. Derek had been presenting our living arrangement as him doing a favor for his elderly father-in-law rather than the other way around. He'd been protecting his ego by pretending that his presence in my house was a form of charity work rather than an admission that he couldn't afford his own place. Sarah was mortified when she learned about Derek's version of events and his comments about me being a parasite. She said she'd had no idea that Derek was telling people I couldn't afford to live alone or maintain the house without help. Sarah had always understood that I was helping them, not the other way around, and she was appalled that Derek had been misrepresenting the situation to make himself look better. She promised that they'd be out of the house within 2 weeks, and she thanked me again for my patience and generosity. Derek's behavior over the next 2 weeks was a perfect example of how entitled people react when their free ride comes to an end. Instead of accepting responsibility for his actions and working to repair our relationship, Derek doubled down on his victim narrative. He complained to anyone who would listen that I was kicking them out unfairly, and that he'd been trying to help me manage my finances. Derek painted himself as a misunderstood good guy who'd been punished for trying to be helpful and supportive. Derek also tried to recruit Sarah to his side by claiming that I was being manipulative and controlling. He suggested that my decision to evict them was really about power and control rather than legitimate grievances about his behavior. Derek tried to convince Sarah that I was testing their marriage and trying to drive a wedge between them. He presented my reasonable boundaries as unreasonable demands and my justifiable anger as irrational hostility. But Sarah wasn't buying Derek's manipulation tactics. She'd seen his entitled behavior firsthand and had been increasingly uncomfortable with his attitude toward me and our living situation. Sarah understood that Derek's assumptions about my financial situation had been insulting, and that his failure to show gratitude had been disrespectful. She supported my decision to ask them to leave and refused to be drawn into Derek's campaign to paint me as the villain. The day Derek and Sarah moved out, Derek made one final attempt to salvage his pride. As they were loading their belongings into the moving truck, Derek approached me with what he probably thought was a generous offer. He said that despite everything that had happened, he was willing to help me find a roommate or tenant to help with the household expenses. Derek claimed that he was concerned about me living alone and wanted to make sure I'd be able to afford the upkeep on such a large house. Even after everything he'd learned about my financial situation, Derek was still trying to position himself as the one with superior knowledge and resources. It was almost impressive how committed Derek was to his delusion that I needed his help and guidance. He simply couldn't accept that he'd been the dependent party in our relationship, so he kept trying to find ways to maintain the fiction that he was the successful one looking out for the struggling older relative. Derek's final comment was that he hoped I'd learned something from our time living together about the benefits of family cooperation and shared resources. I just smiled and wished Derek good luck in his new apartment. 3 months later, I heard through Sarah that Derek and his new roommate were having trouble making rent on their downtown apartment. Apparently, Derek had overestimated his ability to afford city living on his reduced salary, and they were struggling to cover their expenses without the safety net of living rent-free. Derek had been forced to take a part-time weekend job to make ends meet, and he was bitter about having to work extra hours just to maintain the lifestyle he thought he deserved. Sarah also told me that Derek had been complaining to their friends about how I treated them unfairly and kicked them out without cause. According to Sarah, Derek was still telling people that he'd been helping me with my finances and that I'd turned against him out of jealousy or confusion. Derek couldn't admit that he'd been wrong about our situation, so he'd created an alternative history where he was the victim of an ungrateful and unreasonable father-in-law. The funny thing is that Derek's financial struggles after moving out actually proved my point about who had been supporting whom. If Derek had really been in a position to help me with household expenses, he should have been able to afford his own place easily once he was no longer sharing resources with me. Instead, Derek was struggling to cover basic living costs without the benefit of my generosity. His current financial situation revealed that his claims about being the stable provider had been pure fantasy. 6 months after Derek moved out, Sarah filed for divorce. She told me that living on their own had revealed fundamental differences in their values and priorities that she couldn't ignore. Derek's entitlement and his refusal to take responsibility for his mistakes had poisoned their relationship. Sarah said that Derek's behavior during our conflict had shown her a side of his personality that she found disturbing and incompatible with the kind of marriage she wanted. Sarah is now living in a small apartment across town and seems much happier without Derek's constant negativity and manipulation. She visits me regularly and has expressed gratitude for the way I handled the situation with Derek. Sarah said that my firm boundaries and refusal to enable Derek's entitled behavior had helped her see their relationship more clearly. She realized that Derek's pattern of taking credit for other people's generosity while avoiding responsibility for his own failures wasn't limited to his relationship with me. As for me, I'm enjoying having my house back to myself. The peace and quiet is wonderful after months of dealing with Derek's presence and attitude. I've made some improvements to the house that I'd been putting off while they were living here, and I'm planning some projects that will make the space more comfortable for my retirement years. I'm also grateful for the lesson Derek taught me about the importance of setting clear boundaries and not enabling entitled behavior, even from family members. The experience with Derek reminded me that respect and gratitude can't be taken for granted, even in family relationships. Some people will take advantage of generosity if they're allowed to, and they'll create elaborate justifications for their behavior that cast them as the victim or the hero rather than the beneficiary. Derek's assumption that I was financially dependent on him revealed his prejudices about age and class, but it also showed how entitled people can convince themselves that their selfishness is actually generosity. Looking back on the whole situation, I'm actually glad that Derek showed his true colors when he did. If he'd been smarter about hiding his entitlement and manipulation, he might have been able to take advantage of my generosity for much longer. Derek's arrogance and his need to feel superior ultimately worked against him, because he couldn't resist lecturing me and putting me down even while living off my charity. His behavior made it easy for me to see exactly what kind of person he was, and to make the decision to protect myself from further exploitation. The most satisfying part of the whole experience was watching Derek's face when he realized that everything he'd believed about our situation was wrong. The moment when his arrogance crumbled, and he understood that he'd been completely dependent on someone he'd been condescending to, was worth months of aggravation. Derek learned the hard way that assumptions can be dangerous, especially when they're based on stereotypes and prejudices rather than actual facts. Today, I'm living comfortably in my paid-off house, managing my own finances just fine, and enjoying my retirement without anyone calling me a parasite or offering to help me with expenses I don't need help covering. Derek, meanwhile, is working 2 jobs to afford a cramped apartment, and probably still telling people that his father-in-law was unreasonable and ungrateful. The difference between our current situation tells you everything you need to know about who was really supporting whom during those 6 months we lived together. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more tales of justice and karma. Share your thoughts about Derek's behavior in the comments, and don't forget to check out our other videos for more incredible stories of entitled people getting their comeuppance.